welcome back to our Change How You Think weekly video podcast. Now, today we have a special guest, and it's Tricia Frost, and she lives in South Carolina, and she is the co-founder of Shiloh Place Ministries, and their mission statement is to encounter God's love, repair your heart, and redeem your story. And so you can see how similar our ministries are. And so we've been friends for many years. I won't say we're old friends, we never say that anymore. But we've been friends for a long time. And when I heard that Tricia had written a new book on a subject that few people are brave enough to tackle, I just knew that we needed to chat and you needed to hear about it. And so we just want to welcome you, Tricia, because this new book is called Experiencing the Father's Embrace Through Loss and Grief. So welcome, Tricia. It's great to have you on our podcast.
It's so good to see you. Oh my gosh, all the memories that are coming up right now, and just love you and Kathy, because you guys were probably one of the top 3 people in our journey, you know, that helped us to change and discover our identity. So I'm always glad to see you guys.
Well, maybe actually you should tell the viewers, how did our paths cross? Because I mean, we live in different countries. You know, how was it that we ever met each other?
Well, remember when they had that wonderful outpouring of the Father's blessing in Toronto, that everybody was afraid, you know, of what was going on up there because weird stuff was happening up there. But what people really didn't realize, that healing stuff was happening there. And it was and I probably have the timing wrong, whatever, but what I do have right is our encounter. And I think you were there speaking in probably the Healing Life Hurts, or one of the seminars you were speaking in. And somehow we had got connected through John and Carol. And, you know, and so I knew who you were. I don't think you had a clue who we were yet, but we knew who you were. And because you wrote this book, and the book at that time was all about fear and anxiety and depression. And so my initial response to you was going to be fear. You know, whenever Jack drugged me to Toronto. He pulled me. It was a 20th anniversary present. Who gives their wife a present that takes them somewhere that brings healing or gets them fixed? And so that was his motive, was to get me fixed. And somewhere in our back and forth trips, you came into the picture, because probably Jack had researched it out, had heard about you, knew I was struggling with fear, anxiety, and depression. So pulled me back to Toronto. And you were so kind, because we went out to dinner that night. And I sit there at dinner, probably just, you could probably just look at me and think, she's scared to death of me. And you would be right, because you intimidated me. One of the kindest, gentlest people in ministry I've ever met. One of the funniest too. You scared me to death. And I think the reason you scared me, Grant, was because you represented everything I needed and didn't have in my life right then. And that was how to live life out of fear and out of depression. And so anyway, we got to be fast friends. You gave me a copy of your book. I didn't read it. I devoured it. And I began to live my life from your book, because there was hope. And you did it in such a, I don't want to say funny way, but there was so much humor heals. And your humor brought so much healing, that your process and the things that you would say, you know, I was just like, well, that's exactly how I feel. But then you went on to say, okay, if you feel that way, don't, you know, the main thing, Grant, was you brought me down a path of healing without fear, anxiety, and that was big for me, helping me to understand. And you broke off the guilt, the shame, because people who struggle with depression are filled with shame. And so that book lifted the shame, it broke the fear, and then I was able to come out of the depression. And
that's such a funny story. But you know, I'm so glad that we played a small role in your recovery. And then was it shortly after that, or were you and Jack already in White's international ministry at that point, or did that follow?
Well, we were just beginning, because we hadn't written our book yet because that hadn't happened until the encounter with Jack Winter and Eddie Bjork in Toronto. But Jack was being sought after because he did a lot of inner healing type of ministry through his own personal testimony of, he was a Salvation Army officer and he went from being a fisher of fish to a fisher of men. So there was that story behind how he did all that. And so anyway, we were just beginning some notoriety.
So tell us, what was eventually, what did your ministry with Jack grow into? Because your theme was connecting people to the love of the Father, which just blew all of our minds. It was so profound and so life-changing.
Right. Well, right before the revelation of the Father's love and finding out about Toronto, we were on staff at this big church in South Carolina, and we were the minister to ministers. And so we had this heart that we wanted to see ministers. Ministers don't have a place to go, and you know that because so many come to you in your ministry. But we wanted to create an environment of safety to where they could come and be loved on and not told what to do, but just to be loved out of their pain. So that was our initial heart. And so Shiloh Place Ministries, we co-founded that from that goal, that motive. And we moved to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And so in the process of leaving the Salvation Army and stepping into our ministry, Jack began to hear about what was happening in Toronto, the Toronto blessing, and just everything that was going on up there. And so he began to research it out, not telling me about it at all. So then he comes home one day and he goes, for our 20th anniversary, I think we need to go to Toronto and experience this conference. He gave me these articles about the barking dogs and, the negative side of Toronto. And so all this fear began to creep into my heart. And then I realized he's given me an anniversary present to get me fixed. Well, that made it worse because goodness knows I'd have sent him to be with Jesus right then if I could have. And so we went, and in the process of going, of course, all the fear, anxiety, everybody I met, and Bonnie Shavda was one of the speakers, and she got up on the platform and she goes, all you pastors' wives in here that have been so hurt and wounded by church or by ministry, I want you to come forward because I want to pray peace. And she just went on and on about comfort. So let me be honest with you. I didn't go forward. Jack pushed me out of my seat. Again, a death wish for him. So not only am I mad about going to Toronto and this is my anniversary present, I'm ready to stab him for telling me what I need, but I go and I am just overwhelmed, and Bonnie prays for me and I felt so safe. And then I didn't know who Carol was, but later I knew that Carol prayed over me. And
referring to Carol Arnott, John and Carol Arnott, the pastors of the church in Toronto, which is now called Catch the Fire.
Right. Well, she came and just, how Carol would do it, back then, she would just sit and she'd spend the whole night with one person, just stroking them. Well, between her and Bonnie, I was that person. And then somebody else, it probably was Mahesh, I don't know, came up and said the same thing for pastor. So Jack went up, and for 3 hours he was, he was in a little ball, and the ministry team up there prayed for him. Well, that just put a hunger inside of us. It put a realization that we didn't realize we were broken. And if we did realize we were broken, I wasn't going to admit it to you. I'm the pastor of a church. So there was no place for pastors to say, okay, I'm broken, I need help. And Toronto provided that for us. And so out of that, we kept coming back. We figured it out one time. We went to over 18 conferences in less than 5 years, just looking for more and more. And then Jack went one time to a Father Loves You conference, and Jack Winter and Eddie Bjork were the two speakers at that conference. And of course, John and Carol. And so Jack Winter ministered to him. And Jack Winter, and see, God's got a sense of humor. Jack Winter prayed for Jack Frost to receive a revelation of Father's love. And he just asked Jack that one question: has your father ever blessed you? And Jack's father had not. And the story, of course, is in our wonderful book, Experiencing the Father's Embrace. And Jack's father had never blessed him. And that one prayer that Jack Winter prayed over Jack Frost changed Jack. It wasn't a teaching, Grant. It was a healing of Jack's heart. I'd never seen him experience anything. So instead of, when he got home, instead of all the notes he had taken, turning it into a sermon to go fix the next person, he brought it home to us. And he just kept living it. He wouldn't talk. He would do nothing but cry. But he lived out of that love. And that is what really and truly founded who we are today. And what God's done in our life today is the belief, not this. I mean, it was good to have that, but it's that belief of the experience of knowing that you are unconditionally loved and how to change your image. And that's what God began over the next years. We continued to go back to Toronto, and we continued. I am so sorry about that. We continued. I forgot to lock her up.
That's all right.
Capri, stop. And we continued to, just to allow Father to come and heal us. And he did that through people that were healed or were in their process of healing. And so one of the trips there, Jack shared the testimony about Jack Winter, praying over Jack Frost, and John Arnott got a hold of it. And so Jack was asked to share his testimony. Well, my Jack thought it was just because, he's got a wonderful testimony and da-da. And Jack Arnott was like, wouldn't it be fun to have Jack Frost come up and share about how Jack Winter prayed for him? So it was just kind of going to be a joke. And Jack was just it was a new level of humbling for Jack. But it was out of that story that John and Carol began to promote, what God was doing in our life. And so that's how we ended up who we are right now.
And then what were the titles of the books that you and Jack wrote together that really shared this transformation that you personally had experienced with the world?
Right. It was Experiencing the Father's Embrace is our story. It's our testimony and what God did through the healing that we received there. And then we wrote a book called From Spiritual Slavery to Sonship. This is kind of my work copy. And that was all about how we understood that the absence, of this revelation of Father's love produced in us an orphan mindset. And that simply is that feeling that you don't have a safe place, where you belong. And see, when we send the message to people that all I need you for is how you can promote me, and it's sad, but that's what we do in ministry so many times. And that just enhances that orphan mindset in people that I don't belong, except, unless I'm performing. So we just begin to study the orphan mindset again through Jack Winter. He had a real revelation on it. And we begin to study that and apply it to our life, those lies that as an orphan, the thoughts that enter your mind is the negative. Well, I don't belong. I'm broken. That all they see is this, and this. And so it creates a message that you embrace that I'm abandoned. Nobody loves me. Have no value or whatever. And it's so sad that probably that's where most of the world lives. Even some big successful ministries, they live in that same place of let me perform for my name instead of wait a minute, I'm God's kid. And I guess, Grant, and I've seen this in you. If anybody has gone through ministry with you and Kathy, what they see is you're a doctor, a real medical doctor, and you have all this head knowledge. But I think what you have more than anything else is the ability to make people feel comfortable. It's a simple thing to fix our image of who Father is. But what's not so simple is whenever we encounter people that are constantly telling us what to do, and the measuring stick is how well we perform. And so I just feel like there's a world that as they encounter this message, it changes. It changes their intimacy level of who he really is.
Yeah.
You know,
It's basically what you're in a nutshell, what you're saying is that it's gone from head knowledge to heart experience,
right,
because it's the only way we actually change is through an experience, not
right,
just head knowledge. But I'll put links to your website where people can actually get these books, right?
okay,
Order them directly from your ministry.
yeah.
But then Jack then went to be with Jesus. How many years ago was that?
15. Can you believe it's, excuse me, 14? It's been 15 years since he's been out of ministry because he was diagnosed and then he had a 13-month pathway to, we were trying to figure out his healing, went to all these places. Um, so Jack didn't really suffer until his last month of life, but that last month was horrendous. And he went on to be with Jesus. And, you know, um, the night that Jack left this world was such a pleasurable experience that it kind of it's not that we forgot the torment and all, but the night Jack went to be with Jesus, his brother, there was a group of people and there was worship leaders and we were singing over Jack. He was in a coma, and right as he went into the coma, John and Carol Arnott called him. And so Carol, I kept taking the phone because I mean, they probably 30 minutes that Carol, every time I take the phone, she'd be screaming at Jack, "You have to live. You can't die. You have a plan, a purpose, this whole revelation of love." And Carol was speaking life and life and life over Jack because Jack had an unusual connection with Carol because he was never able to experience, a mother's love and especially touch. And anytime we went to Toronto, Carol always positioned Jack next to her. Or take that back. It was usually Carol, John, no, John, Carol, me, and Jack. But Carol would just slip around like that. She'd see Jack coming and she'd just take that finger. She's always got that finger going. And she would just go, "Jack, Jack." And she would touch him and he would be out on the floor for hours. But he was made to feel comfortable. And in that place of comfort, and that's my goal is how do I make people feel as comfortable in the presence of love as Carol and John did for us, and as you and Kathy have done for us. When fear is removed, peace abounds. And so I tell people, if you want healing, find the people that walk where you want to walk. Find the people that live in peace, no matter what their situational circumstances are. Are they peaceful? Do they make you feel comfortable?
Yeah, because that's a reflection. If I always tell my kids when they're assessing someone that they're meeting for the first time, or just do they relax you?
Yeah. Oh, that's
Because
good.
if they, because that is the easiest way to assess someone's emotional baggage.
Yeah. Well, once you get past that initial fear, because I'm just going to say, you nor John nor Carol relaxed me until I was actually able to come into your presence and really assess who you were. And there was no fear, there was no anxiety, and none of y'all, Jeremy and Connie. And so God kept drawing us back to that place of healing. And so here we are. The ministry was 30 years old, 15 years with Jack, 15 years without Jack. And the message is still abundant and lively.
So because of the experience you went through in losing Jack, then you've written this very powerful book. So tell us what's the purpose of this new book? Because it just came out. And so we want people to know about it because not that many people are willing to talk about or such a tender subject.
Well, everybody's experienced loss. And the problem with loss is people don't realize there's a grief that comes with loss. You actually have to identify your loss so you can grieve that loss. We all need to grieve loss. And because that deals with emotions, it deals with your inner core and who you are. You know, people don't want to go there because they don't want to encounter the fact that maybe they're broken. And so you're not broken, but nobody's telling them they're not broken. And they have all this emotional baggage and stuff that they're dealing with. And so, um, I always wanted to write this book. 2 years after Jack died, I felt like I was supposed to write a book and call it The Widow's Might, MIGHT, strong widows, courage, and da da da. And I wanted to write a book about courage and the positive side of overcoming devastating situational circumstances. And the reason I felt like I could do that is because in the process of my grief, so many people did so many wonderful things, Grant, and I appreciated it. But I had a stack of books, at least a foot high, on how to overcome grief. I didn't want to overcome grief. I wanted to walk through the process and come out on the other side healed of my grieving heart. So anyway, I couldn't read anything. Well, Bill and Benny Johnson had just written Bill's book, Strengthen Yourself in the Lord. And Bill sent me a copy of it. I don't know when he sent it, but I probably put it on that stack and then one day went to it. But the whole book was about courage. Through all of your situational circumstances, through all of life, how do you land on your feet with courage and hope? And Bill would put a little note in there and it said, Trisha, you're going to have to make some hard decisions over the next course of your life. And I pray that you make the decisions of this book. And the book was all about Joshua 1:9. Be strong, be courageous. And here's for me the part that I didn't get. For the Lord your God is with you. I knew that, Grant, because we had just had this amazing revelation of God's love. And so the point that Bill was talking about, the choice I had to make is, do I believe the message we carry? Because if I do, then I can move forward. If I don't, I need to stop. So that day I chose to pick up the courage that Bill and Benny had prayed over me for. And I choose to believe what I had experienced, what Jack had experienced. And so in the course of that, 13 years went by and I always wanted to write this book. And my son-in-law, Doug Crew, came to me, and because I was probably, I can't write the book, you know how you do, you whine or whatever. And he came to me one day and he goes, the reason you can't write that book, I mean, he was in my face, is because you're writing the wrong book. And I'm going, do what? What you talking about? And he goes, Trisha, you're writing the wrong book. You are focused on writing a book about widowhood, but you should be focused on writing a book about loss. So many people have loss. And during that time, a year and a half ago, the buzzword was story. What is everybody's story? The Pixar story. What's your story, Grant? I want to know your story. And that seems to be an easy way to encounter someone that's dealing with pain, is tell me your story. So when he said that to me, it began to make me think, I want to write a book on hope and courage and overcoming, but I want to deal with loss. So I just began to think about, who are the people in my life that have had excruciating losses? And I began to ask the Lord to show me who those people were. And one by one, I began to write down people's names. And then Larry Sparks from Destiny Image called me one day and he goes, Trisha, I want you to write a book on loss. I don't want you to write a book on being a widow. I want you to write a book on loss. Well, that was confirmation of what my son-in-law was saying. So I began to interview people. There was a couple that their son was murdered. A guy walked up to him in a store and shot him, point blank range. And when they asked him why he did that, he said, I just wanted to know what it felt like to take another person's life. He had watched some kind of crazy movie. And then there's stories in there. Another person, they lost a child through trauma and through death. And so in their story, like in the story where their child was murdered, they had to forgive, and the forgiveness came when 5 years after the guy that lost his son was able to go to prison, which this never happens. A victim can never see a perpetrator. He got into prison 5 years on the very day this man killed his son. He led that man to the Lord. The only way, now here's where the residual stuff comes in. you and John and Carol Arnott are a big part of that story, because it was through your book of anxiety and depression that caused my friend Pat, who that would depress anybody, to not just lose a child, but to lose it to murder, because now you got to forgive. You don't want to forgive anybody. You want to murder somebody yourself. And then John's book on the art of forgiveness, I think was the name of it at that time. Um, for the next 6 months, she stayed into those two books, and her heart was healed. She was able to forgive the man that shot her. That story, how her journey, her pathway, how she grieved the loss to find her healing, all of that is in her story. Now, because it's a story, you're going to have to pick out the pieces of what she did. She identified her pain. She forgave the person that hurt her. She had to let go of the loss, da da da. So those kinds of stories are in there. There's a loss of abandonment. A friend of mine, her husband divorced her. She came home from a conference and he had packed up his stuff and left, didn't tell her. See, this sounds horrible, but I had rather had lost Jack through death than through abandonment. And so the loss of abandonment, how do you deal with the abandonment of someone that you trust more than anybody else in the world? That story's in there. And then there's the story of loss of relationships, loss of jobs, the story of a pastor who lost his church, lost his vision, lost ministry, lost covenant brother relationships. That story's in there. And yes, the story of being a widow. My story, there's some fun parts to my story too. It's not just the sorrow. I want to, again, I don't want to write a book that's all focused on sorrow and leads to depression. I tell some of the funny things that people said to me. And then I tell, one of the stories is about John Arnott. John invited me to this big conference, and it was the TBN conference, their 10-year celebration. He called me on the phone, and John gets an idea and he'll run with it. And he goes, Trisha, I want you to come to our 10-year celebration of doing this conference at TBN, not TBN, CBN, the Robertsons. So he goes, all expenses paid if you'll just come, and special seating, da da da. So I went thinking I'm going to be on the first row or second row, up there with John and Carol. We've had a drastic influence on their ministry too. And he put me on what I call widow's row. He had special seating, but it was all the widows. There were like a whole row of white-headed people. I was 52 years old when Jack died. These people were 70, 75, 80, and John sits me with them. Oh my Lord Jesus, I could have sent John to be with Jesus that day, but I wanted to focus on the gift. But I got up and moved closer up front. I found a seat that was closer to the front. But the things that happen to you, because that chapter is all about being labeled. I don't want to be labeled a widow. I don't want to be labeled something that represents depression, and then that'll produce fear and anxiety again. I want to be labeled as someone who had a loss and found her pathway, because everybody's path is different. If you try to do my path, then that's the 7 steps of grieving, which those are good. I'm not condemning those. But what was my path during those 8 steps? And I had to focus on my individuality. And so the book is all about stories, finding your individuality to identify your loss, encounter God's love, repair your heart and redeem your history, basically, no matter what your loss is. So again, the book's about loss.
But yet it's about victory.
Right. Yeah, that's what I meant. It's about being an overcomer without being told how to overcome. Because if I tell you how to overcome, I set you up for failure.
But also, I mean, head knowledge is so different from hard experience. So this is a book about victory and encouragement through really difficult pathways.
Right.
That
everybody's got a situational circumstance. In my book Unbound, which is the book that I wrote after Jack died, but we kind of wrote it together because I just kind of took his stories and put them together. But everybody's got a situational circumstance, and if you're not careful, you get stuck. And if you get stuck, then you've got lost again. So I don't want to stay in my situational circumstance, but mine's not yours, Grant. But I can take your experience and it offers me hope, but it's still my own experience.
So this book is about victory and hope through really intense suffering that for many people stops them cold, and their life is frozen from that point forward. So this book has a very unique role among people who have suffered real intense difficulties. And so, so this is a breakthrough book, Tricia, because you're just taking on a subject, one that you have spiritual authority to talk about, and few do, and that the power of God's love and God's heart now is you're expressing it even in situations that people just sort of want to hide their eyes from. So,
right, exactly.
so below this video, I'll put links to your website where people can actually get these tools, like all the books that you've written, which is all about really healing our hearts and transforming our lives. So
Exactly.
this is, it's so great to talk to you again, Tricia, and to hear what you're doing, and that you're still changing lives. And that also the other message is God doesn't waste our experiences, that
Right,
he uses these experiences to transform your heart. And now you're transforming the hearts of people who then encounter these stories in your book. So Tricia, I just want to thank you for being with us today. And it's wonderful just reconnecting and remembering some of these amazing stories, and just remembering, remembering Jack, what a great guy he was. And so Tricia, we just want to thank you, and we'll give everyone a link so that they can connect to your ministry at Shiloh Place Ministries, and in all your resources. And so I really hope this is not the last time we chat. So
I hope so too. And thank you, Grant, for the honor. I appreciate it. And I've said this many times before, but if it hadn't been for you and Kathy and the price you guys have paid, we wouldn't be who we are today. So there's always a huge thank you for that.
Well, and of course, that was because we had a marriage crisis that God took us through, and that's why we wrote the book. So God redeems our experiences. So
he does, and that's neat.
So it's great having you with it, Tricia.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.